My name is Joe. I'm an alcoholic. It's good to be here. I want to thank LaFawn and the committee for inviting me. It's always an honor and a privilege to be asked to share in Alcoholics Anonymous. The only problem with that is that I have an alcoholic ego, and I need to remind myself where I come from and who gets the credit for this. I wasn't really going to talk about this until Sunday, but I think sometimes a trap, and there are a lot of traps on the spiritual path and in Alcoholics Anonymous. One of the biggest traps for a speaker and for a listener is to begin to put something on the person or what they hear and forget where the power comes from. I was 7.5 years sober, and I was writing inventory, and I found within myself a form of denial that I don't hear talked about a lot in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was stronger than the denial I came here with. I think that kind of denial we hear talked about a lot when you're in denial of the disease of alcoholism. And you go to treatment or you come to Alcoholics Anonymous. And we talk about denying the disease that you suffer from. And we talk about that a lot when someone's new. But I found within myself at 7.5 years, and I don't think I'm unique, and I don't think I'm special, and I don't think I'm different from any alkie that I've ever met. And I found this denial within myself, and I saw that it was there before, and I'm sure I'll find it again. And sometimes this form of denial comes out in real subtle ways. Sometimes it's a little more blatant. California, you see somebody get up and take a birthday cake for 10 or 15 or 20 years. Somebody in the back of the room goes, "How did you do it?" And that's real subtle. And you get up and you say, "My name is Joe, and I'm an alcoholic, and I'm powerless over alcohol, and my life is unmanageable." And then you spend 15 or 20 minutes telling everybody how you keep yourself sober and manage your life. Sometimes it comes out real blatant. I've heard a lot of people say, "I just don't drink, no matter what." And I tend to forget that I drink, no matter what. And that alcoholism isn't something I can just make up my mind about. If I could make up my mind about alcoholism and just not drink, I would not be here 10 years after my last drink in Baton Rouge, Louisiana on a Friday night. If I could do that. Sometimes it's as blatant as me taking the credit for what I've been giving and what I've been given. And I found out the denial that I suffer from time to time, is the denial of the grace of God. That this is a free, undeserved, unearned gift. And I've had to do a lot of work to realize that. Because, see, I'm the kind of guy that thinks it's all this great work that I've done. It's kind of a paradox. And I think as we go through this, we will see at different times the paradoxes of the spiritual path in Alcoholics Anonymous that make no intellectual sense. Give it away to keep it. I mean, that's not where I come from. Surrender to win. Admit that you don't have any power to receive power. On and on and on and on. Paradox after paradox after paradox on this spiritual path. Bill described it really well himself. Common sense would become uncommon sense. And he said that in his story. I understand that. Because a guy who had to hold on to what he had to keep it and fight for it and never gave up to win now believes something totally different in my heart. And I have to be real careful of this kind of denial when I start to take the credit. I think when someone decides to go through this process, however long you're sober, and I think that's the great thing about Alcoholics Anonymous, and my interest in this 10 years away from my last drink is encouraged nowadays by people that have been doing this for a long, long time. I currently live in Santa Monica, California, and my home group is the Big Book group in Santa Monica. We have 5 meetings a week, different parts of Los Angeles, and I'm proud to be a member of that group. My sponsor lives in Denver, Colorado, where I got sober in 1982. I also have a spiritual advisor, for lack of a better name. She's a woman, and I've learned a lot from women in Alcoholics Anonymous. One of my friends that I'm here visiting included. And she's been doing this process for 32 years in Alcoholics Anonymous. Willing to submit themselves to the first 9 steps on a regular basis. Now, that in itself is an interesting idea. Because I have found, once I did this work, and that sometimes we have different lingo, and that's the lingo I have for going through the steps. After the first time I did it, my life was totally rearranged. I became real interested in people doing these steps, people interested in this book. Joe and Charlie, my sponsor, his sponsor, people in Denver where there seems to be a large core of people that do this work. And I think the exciting thing is nowadays when I go around the country that there are pockets of us all over the country now that have been doing it for a long time, that believe in this process, some that are newly interested in returning to the basics of Alcoholics Anonymous again. And some people say there's a real... I saw Joe and Charlie not too long ago. They're good friends of mine, and they said that everywhere they go, that there seems to be a new resurgence of people going back to the book. I've been some places where I live and in some other states where I try to share the message of Alcoholics Anonymous, and people come up to me and say, what an interesting new approach you have. And I find that somewhat interesting, and I find that somewhat sad. So if this process can be real for me wherever I am, I heard about the 3rd time through these steps, and I've gone through these steps every year for 10 years. That means 1 through 9. That doesn't mean I write the same inventory that I wrote the first time. That doesn't mean I make the same amends that I made before. Some of those people are still in my life, and some of them I still write about, but it's current. I mean, if I was to begin the steps tonight, as I will next month, from a decision that I made a year ago in April, and having decided who I'd like to do that with this year, I haven't always done it with my sponsor, but I am glad to have a sponsor who has what I want and is a participant in all 3 parts of this program. because of a decision I made a year ago, I will begin this work again next month, and when I'm ready to do that, it has to be, where am I with alcohol today? Where am I with the second step today? Where am I with this third step decision today? What about my inventory? I think one of the most exciting things about this lady that I mentioned, and my sponsor, and a lot of other people that I know, is when you talk to them about inventory, it's not like a fond recollection. I know people, you ask about inventory and they go, well, I remember back in and it's like a fond recollection, this experience that they had. And some people get so far away from their experience that they forget. I heard a guy one time and he said, I don't know if I should talk to newcomers anymore because I can't remember what it was like. And I thought, my God, I hope I never become that useless in Alcoholics Anonymous. So number one, and I'm not into the great debate, because when you go around the country, you really see two basic schools of thought as far as people that are into these steps. And the two basic schools seem to be, you work the first 9 steps once, and you live in 10, 11, and 12. And then the other school says, you do the first 9 steps on a regular basis, and you live the rest of the time in 10, 11, and 12. I'm not into that debate because of what has happened in my experience. But I became interested in that not too long ago, when I was about 6 years sober. And I started talking to people that I know. And I started reading more of our literature, and literature that I hadn't read for a while, to see what was said about that. Because for some reason, I'm interested in what I do. I think that's a little different than being interested in yourself, but for a long time in my life, I wasn't much interested in what I did. I just did what I did. What I did was drink. But I was kind of interested, and I traced it back all the way to the very beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous, to our founders, Bill and Bob. I think Bill had an amazing experience. It's described pretty well in this book and in some of our other literature, and to some it might be of the burning bush variety, and quite a profound experience. I mean, from the way I understand it, I can't even comprehend. Can you possibly comprehend being 2 years sober and waking up in your room one night to a blinding light and sitting down in a few hours and writing that unbelievable chapter, how it works? I mean, the guy was amazing. He had a profound experience. But then I look at what happened. Several years, quite a number of years of depression. He tried a little of this and a little of that, and had some troubles, and was at the same time real involved. Ran the office for a long time, etc., etc. Dr. Bob, on the other hand, was greatly influenced by a man that we don't hear talked about a lot anymore, who's in a lot of our literature. And I think some of the time we don't hear this man talked about. I mean, we hear Dr. Silkworth talked about a lot. We hear Carl Jung talked about a lot. Sometimes you hear Sam Shoemaker talked about, but I think Dr. Bob, from what I've read, was greatly influenced by a man that was aware of something that some of us don't want to talk about much, especially those of us that have been around for a while. And his name was Harry Tiebout. And Harry Tiebout knew about something in an alcoholic that not a lot of people knew about, and a lot of people don't know about today. And I think one of the major things that Harry Tiebout knew about was the resurgence of the ego after having a spiritual awakening. What the ego does having had a spiritual awakening. And he encouraged Bob to rework and rework and rework the first 9 steps on a regular basis. And Bob wrote about that. And finally, through his encouragement to Bill, Bill did that again and came out of that depression that he had been in. Now, what about my own experience? My own experience has been that my ego does something with power. I believe the 12 steps are to reduce the ego, to deflate the ego. And I believe the 12 steps are a spiritual process. But if the ego's never been deflated, it would never even know it was regrowing. It would just continue on. That doesn't mean someone can't stay sober. I have seen people who have stayed sober a long time on the grace of God by itself. I've seen people stay sober who drank like me in the fellowship by itself. That has not been my experience. I go through the first 9 steps the first time, and I don't finish amends. And believe me, and that's one of the things I want to talk about this weekend, there were plenty of people in the fellowship saying, you'll never finish amends. You can't finish amends. How can you ever finish amends? Thank God I met some people who had finished amends several times. That to me means, that doesn't mean they're all completed. That doesn't mean I don't have some in my life that are ongoing. That doesn't mean I'm still not making amends to my family who I caused so much harm to. That means that I have gone to them and I've made the approach and I've said my thing and I'm doing the best I can with God's help with everyone I've ever harmed. I met some people that said you could do that. And the second time through this work, I finished amends for the first time and my life took off like a rocket. From a guy who hadn't worked for 9 years, I was made the director of a prevention program for the National Council on Alcoholism in Denver. I hadn't worked for 9 years. I had a degree that I never thought I'd ever be able to use. Now, I have since then, twice, in the last 8 years, not finished amends. Ones that I was aware of, and I knew where they were. My ego does something. My ego gets me to settle for relief rather than to go for freedom. That's another thing I want to talk about this weekend. Reaching a point in Alcoholics Anonymous where you decide to start to go for freedom rather than just relief. Because see, there's a lot you can do in AA nowadays for relief. And by that I mean me doing what I can do so I can feel better. But I woke up one day and realized that's not much different than my drinking. That's a major pattern of my life that hasn't been broken yet. Me doing whatever I can do, running over anybody, whatever's necessary for me to feel good. Well, what about going for real freedom? What about the idea of starting these steps to go beyond what you even think to be true? I mean, I would say that anybody in this room that's ever written inventory the way it is in our book, the way that we'll talk about this weekend, anybody who's ever written an inventory that way has been taken from things they thought were absolutely true in the first 2 columns and found out that they were big lies. And for a guy like me to be taken past what he knew to be true is a spiritual experience. Because I come to this, whether I'm new or old or in between, I come to this with some basic ideas. I come to this with knowledge. My God, I had been to 10 treatment centers. I had become a therapist in one. I had a master's degree in psychology. And the first thing my sponsor ever told me when I met him was, he said, Joe, you know enough about alcoholism yourself and how you feel to be dangerous to yourself and everybody around you. He said, why don't you say a prayer that everything you think you know be put aside for an open mind and a new experience. And you know what? I drank enough. That's another thing I like to talk about. Have I drank enough to be open to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous? Have I been beat by the great persuader into a state of reasonableness? Because see, not everybody in AA has. Nothing worse than watching somebody in AA trying to use AA to get done drinking. Trying to use AA to get done drinking is worse than drinking with a head full of AA. So I come to this, whether it's the first time or the 10th time, with some things that I think I know. The other thing that I'm real big on now, currently, for me, is perception and awareness. Perception of truth and awareness of God. Perception is a real interesting thing. For example, I was in Denver a few months ago, and I was at a meeting, and there was a guy at the meeting, and he was whining and complaining about the traffic in Denver. And I'd been there for a week, and I was just zooming around town. Leave 10 minutes before the meeting, and you're there before it even starts, and you're home 10 minutes after the meeting. And my God, in Los Angeles, sometimes just to go to a meeting is like a major deal. Other people I've met that live in the country understand that too. But here's this guy, and he's complaining about driving around Denver. And I said to him, you ought to go to Los Angeles for a couple of weeks and drive around and come back, and maybe your perception would be changed to where you'd appreciate the traffic in Denver. And we had both been driving in the same city, but we saw it different. And my perception changes. There's a perception that I talk funny. There's a perception that you all talk funny. Depends on how you look at it, right? Several months ago, in March last year, I was holding on to 4 amends from that year's inventory. Now, I didn't want to finish them. And I watched this movie called Jacob's Ladder. And I watched this movie, and I thought it was a movie about a guy who almost died in Vietnam and then had trouble living when he came back to the United States. Now, between the first time I saw this movie and the next time I saw this movie, nothing really went on except I finished those 4 amends. And everything that I saw was different. And I saw that movie again, and I realized this is a movie about a guy who died in Vietnam, and the rest of the movie is about everything he wasn't willing to let go of just before he died on the operating table. And at the end of the movie, and I hadn't even caught this the first time, at the end of the movie, this guy says to him, if you're holding on, and you're not willing to let go, and you're afraid of dying, all you'll see are devils tearing you away from your life. But if you've let go, and you've made your peace, and you're willing to go, those same devils will be angels taking you to a better place. It all depends on how you look at it. And my perception changed. I mean, if you ask anybody that's been around here for a while about what really changes here, I mean, life goes on. I'm either free with the way it is or I'm bound by it. Jobs change. The economy changes. For some of us, and I don't like admitting this, relationships change. On and on and on. Money changes. Can I be at peace however it is? What really changes here is my awareness and my perception. My sponsor's been saying something to me for 10 years I didn't even get till a couple years ago. And by get, I don't mean get up here in my head. I mean get down here. The difference between knowledge and experience. He's been saying to me for 10 years, he says, Joe, you know, nobody in these rooms is any closer to God than anybody else in these rooms. And nobody in these rooms is any closer to God than the last time they took a drink. The only thing that changes here is our awareness of a presence that's been there all the time. God hasn't gone anywhere. And I started to get that. And I started to see you different. And I started to see me different. And I started to experience the awareness of God different. I think the best analogy about the difference between knowledge and experience is the story about 2 little twin brothers who decide to find out about having an orgasm. They're about 12, 13 years old. One brother figures he's going to go learn what it would be like to have one. So he goes to school and he studies and he studies and he learns and he finds out everything he can. My God, he becomes a professor at Harvard University and teaches a class on what it would be like to have an orgasm. He knows more than any human should even be allowed to know about what it would be like to have an orgasm. But he's never had one. The other brother, he goes off and within a few weeks he finds a little girl who shows him how to have one. And who knows more about what it would be like to have one? Right. But I come to this process with knowledge. So how do I get past what I think I know? I guess the question is, am I willing to go past what I believe today? For some reason, on a regular basis for the last 10 years, I have had that desire. Probably from the results I've gotten. And probably because I don't ever want to drink again. And probably because I realize on a regular basis I need the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was celebrating a birthday one time, and somebody that I sponsor got up and said, I'm really, really glad to have a sponsor sick enough to need the whole program. And I thought to myself, my God, I thought they were going to say nice things about me, and then I realized that's probably one of the greatest things that someone could say about me. I have not risen above alcoholism. Drinking is an issue. The only problem with that is it's not anything I can deal with or cope with or make go away or make from happen again. That's why I seek God. I think there's 2 places in the book that ask me to remember. And one asked me to remember in the beginning of the 9th step that I agreed to go to any length for victory over alcohol. And the other one is the one we hear all the time when we hear how it works read, and that is, remember, you're dealing with alcohol. Cunning, baffling, powerful. It comes in many forms. The greatest lesson my spiritual advisor has ever taught me when it went from here to here, when it was no longer just knowledge, but a part of my experience, is when she helped me see that when you're fighting resentment, or when you're fighting fear, or when you're dealing with selfishness, or you're being dishonest, you're not fighting what you're feeling. If you're an alcoholic, the bottom line is not what you're feeling. The bottom line is alcohol. And when you're fighting resentment, you're fighting booze. And I need to remember that when I'm a little angry and I want to get up and I want to tell you why, I want to tell you all why I'm angry, and I want you to be convinced that it's just a little anger that I have. Because see, I forget that it's about me and alcohol. My life experience, and that's what I go back to when I search for truth, my life experience shows me when I stay angry, I drink. And who's to say that's any different now? I met a man one time and he said, after 20 years in Alcoholics Anonymous, I realized I didn't have a drinking problem, I had a living problem. And I began to pursue living. Not that that's not what we should be doing, but he began to pursue living. And one day he realized that a little alcohol might help him with his living problem, and he almost died. There's a prayer that I've used, and I think the book refers to it, and I think the people that have shared with me think the book refers to it in several places, and I encourage people to use it in their own words, in their own way. I would never tell anybody how to pray. That I've used since the first time I did this work, and I've used it to the last time I've done this work. And I use it from the time I start the first step until I get to the 3rd step. And the prayer has to do with, please put aside what I think I know so that I can have an open mind and a new experience. And I sometimes get specific with what I would like to have put aside. What I know about this book, what I know about these steps, what I know about myself, what I know about my disease, what I know about God. Please put all this aside so that I may have an open mind and a new experience with all these things. Amen. Now, my first experience with that, I did it because I was told to, because I had drank enough. My last experience with it, I did it because it's worked every other time. And I was doing the work with a group of 8 people, and we decided that we were going to spend 3 weeks in the first step, and a week in the second step, and a week in the third step, and then write inventory. And somewhere in those first 3 weeks, I started the prayer at the beginning, and somewhere in these 3 weeks, I woke up 5 days in a row. You know the difference between waking up with something going on in your head already without you, or waking up and starting to think about something? Well, I woke up 5 days in a row with going on in my head without me. Doubt. Whether I ever experienced this craving for alcohol, ever. And I had looked at this work 9 other times. And I knew the prayer was working. See, when I can get taken to a place where I'm looking at the question from both sides, that's what it means to me to have an open mind. Of all the people I've ever worked with, and I've talked to my sponsor about this, and of all the people he's ever worked with, and I talked to another man who's worked with more people than either one of my sponsors, and my sponsors worked with a lot of people. This man that gave me this piece to consider talked about of all the people he's ever worked with, there's 3 types of people that approach the first step. And I don't care if it's the first time or the 20th time, there's 3 types of alcoholics that approach the first step. And he says the first one is the bigot. And the bigot says, I know. He either knows that he is or he knows that he isn't. It doesn't matter. It's the same scale. But he knows. And ain't nobody going to tell him anything different. And what the bigot is filled with is contempt prior to investigation. Contempt without any consideration. He knows. And he knows what he knows is true. Now, we all have a bit of the bigot in each of us. How do I get past that? Chapter How It Works says we had to let go of our old ideas that didn't work. Until we let go absolutely, the result was nil. So the question is, can I get rid of my old ideas on my own power? How do I let go? Well, part of how I let go is to pray. The chapter to the agnostic says, we beg of you to lay aside prejudice. Another part of the chapter to the agnostic says, don't let any prejudice you have keep you from honestly asking yourself what these spiritual terms mean to you that you read in this book. And there is a solution, a guy that Bill and Bob are 12-stepping says, the moment I made up my mind to go through with the process, it meant I had to throw several lifelong conceptions out the window. So how do I get past being the bigot, holding on to what I know, one end of the scale or the other? I pray. Then there's the man that's the hardest one in AA to work with. This is the pious man. And the pious man doesn't just know. He believes. And he usually uses God to justify it. The pious man isn't filled with contempt. The pious man is filled with acceptance. He just accepts anything. He's the nodder and the shaker. You can usually tell him by the last person he talked to. He's the guy in the bar, if he's sitting between a Democratic and a Republican, he's in big trouble. Because he believes. He either believes that he is or he believes that he isn't. It doesn't matter. Same scale. Then there's the man of consideration, who for some God knows reason has been put in the middle, willing to look at both sides. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm not. He's more interested in seeking truth than knowledge. Willing to let go of what he thinks he knows. So for some reason, all I can say to you about that is that for the last 10 years, each time I've started these steps, by using that prayer and whatever willingness I bring to this based on however much I drank, I have been taken to a place to start this work where I'm willing to look at the both sides of every question. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. Wouldn't it be great to find out after all these years I'm really not an alcoholic and I don't need to do this and it's just another lie that I've bought? I mean, it wouldn't be the first. I've become every group I've ever been around. How do I know I haven't just bought the company line of Alcoholics Anonymous? I mean, you only have to be around here a few weeks to get the lingo. You get a few words, craving, obsession, you fit them into your story. How do I know I haven't just fit my drinking into the company line and become what you all think I want to be? How do I know I haven't done that again? Am I willing after all these years to go back and look at my experience with new eyes? So I'm doing this for the third time, probably around 1985, and I hear this ex-Catholic priest speak, a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, 26 years sober, doing the work for 26 years, every year, once a year. And he says, when I considered the first step for the 26th time, I never assumed the first step. And he lost me. I didn't know what he meant. And I was getting ready to do the work with some friends, and I went to him, and I said, John, I heard you speak, and you said that for the 26th time through this, I'm just in awe of that. People that are willing to do that after all those years, not willing to just settle for what they've been given and rest on their laurels and trick themselves into thinking they're doing stuff with 10 and 11. They're the ones that'll tell you, gee, I really haven't caused any harm for a long time. Haven't had to make any amends for quite some time now. Yeah. I'd like to meet any alcoholic that hasn't done that for a long time, right? If they're being honest. Is it possible to be asleep on your feet, dreaming that you're alive? So I'm encouraged by these people that talk about waking up. Inventory brings me out of the fog. Amends sets me back out there in the world, free. I take what I think is the truth and I put it in the first two columns, and I find out that what I thought was true was a lie. So what if you find out what you think is valuable isn't? My God, I heard a man with 24 years the other day who I had the privilege of taking through these steps when he was 24 years sober, and I saw him not too long ago, and he's in the middle of amends, and he's on fire, and his whole perception has changed. And he said that he came to this process with, he was ready to lose his car, he lost the girlfriend, he lost the house, his law partner was throwing him out, and he thought he had lost everything, and that he had nothing. And what he found out was that he hadn't lost anything, and he had everything there for him all the time. And all he was screwed up about was about the difference between everything and nothing. And his perception changed. And I'm in awe of that. People with that amount of time willing to do this, because this, the way it's been shared with me, is not easy. I love when I meet somebody that says, if it's God's will, it feels good. Right? My God, I damn near killed myself for 17 years drinking and using and believing that what felt good was good. Right? And I have done some things in this program that I know, that I absolutely know in my heart are God's will, that didn't necessarily feel good. Making amends doesn't always feel good when you're sitting there with somebody and you make the mistake of saying, do you need to tell me how any of this hurt you? And then you sit there and shut up and listen, right? And my perception changes. I had an idea about, because in Denver they say anybody here in their first 30 days, and they clap and they all say, keep coming back. And I used to have a perception about that. And I'm sitting at a meeting one day, and there's a guy at York Street in Denver. Everybody knows, but the leader of the meeting doesn't know. She came from some other group, and everybody knows this guy, and he's been around forever, and he's always new. And she says, is there anybody new? And there's a couple new people, and he raises his hand. He says, I'm so-and-so, and I'm in my first 30 days. And everybody claps, and she says, keep coming back. He raises his hand again before she goes any further, and he says, can I say something? And she says, yeah. He says, I wish you all wouldn't clap every time I come back, because I get more attention when I'm new than after I've been around for a while. And please quit telling me to keep coming back, because that's my problem. I think I can. And my perception changed. I take a person's name and I put it in the first column. She. Because I'm upset one week because the girl I wanted to marry left me. And I'm going around to meetings in Los Angeles for a few days, and I'm just milking the heck out of it, right? Oh, she left me. And my friend who's willing to risk my sensitive alcoholic feelings comes up to me and he says, why don't you go home and write inventory about her leaving you? And I go home and the book tells me to put what I think is the truth about why I'm angry. And if you would have asked me that week, Joe, why are you hurting? Why are you upset? Why are you angry? What's your truth? I would have said, because she left me. So I go home and I put her name. We have a different way of saying it in our group, but I won't say it here. I put her name in the first column of a piece of paper. This silly, stupid inventory process outlined in our book. And then I put left me, because it says to put why I'm angry. So I have this truth. I'm angry because she left me. And then I'm somehow given the grace to see where, when she left me, 7 different areas of self were hurt, threatened, or interfered with. You know, because when she left me, it affected my self-esteem, and my pride, and my ambition, and my security, and my sex relations. Then I'm given the grace to see where my selfishness and how I did it with her, and my dishonesty and how I did it with her, and my self-seeking and how I did it with her, and my fears drove her away. And the truth in the first column became a lie, and the lie that I had anything to do with it became the truth. And my perception changed. Because you know what? She didn't leave me. I drove her away. Now, you can do one of 2 things with truth. You can beat yourself up with it for what a rotten, terrible person you are, and that's just ego. The reverse side of ego. I used to think ego was just me telling you what a great, wonderful, spiritual person I am. I also found out it's me telling you what a rotten, terrible individual I am, because I either have to be the sickest in the room or the wellest in the room. Never can just be one of the guys. And I found that's just the other end of ego. Or you can take the truth and realize your troubles are of your own making. I hate to use this word, but that shit doesn't just happen. California, they got bumper stickers and t-shirts now that say, shit happens. The greatest statement of hope in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is that my troubles are of my own making. Thank God, because you know what? The person in the first column that I thought caused my troubles didn't have to change, get well, or come back for me to get free. Thank God my troubles are of my own making, and there can be great freedom in that admission rather than beating yourself up. And my perception changed. And when my perception of truth changes, my awareness of God changes.
One moment, please. One moment, please. The tape will start shortly. Please be patient. The speaker will continue shortly.
Here's a question to consider. Is there a difference between the grace of God and a conscious contact? I've seen people who have stayed sober in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that are just as much alky as me stay sober on the grace of God. Now, I don't have a long period of time that I can tell you about what it was like experiencing that. I've had some short times since then, but I only had 5.5 months. And at 5.5 months, I was up against the root of my disease. I was dying of untreated alcoholism, and I was ready to drink again. But I can tell you what those 5 months were like. Those 5 months were like sitting in a dark room, feeling pretty good, knowing that somewhere in this room there's a light switch, and I can turn the light on. But see, I didn't know where the switch was. But there was a timer on the light, and sometimes the lights would come on, and sometimes they would go off, but I didn't have anything to say with when the lights came on and when the lights went off, and I kind of just felt moved around. I'd wonder, how did I end up here? Or, my God, I'm 90 days sober. There must be the realization that something greater than yourself is taking place in your life is to realize the grace of God. And I think probably everybody in this room, to some extent or the other, has either realized or experienced the grace of God. But what about going for a contact with that power? And I think the difference between a conscious contact with real power and experiencing the grace of God are like night and day. And that's what I would like to have. I would like to have that contact where you can really do something with 10 and 11, where you can really start to live life free. Do something when stuff crops up and ask for it to be removed and turn back to someone you can help, and really start to learn about proper use of the will, and really start to learn about living in the moment. The function of my ego is to get me anywhere but where God is. And the only place God is in the moment. And the only place my ego doesn't want me is in the moment. So it wants to keep me in yesterday, or 3 hours ago, or 2 weeks ago, or 3 hours from now, or 3 days from now, or 3 weeks from now. That's where it likes to keep me. And when confronted with any problem, it likes to keep the blame out here. I think we hear a lot about shame nowadays in Alcoholics Anonymous, the big movement, the big catchphrase nowadays, shame. I think that's a cover-up from another phenomena that takes place in me that I think is me feeling shameful, is blame. Because see, that's what my ego wants to do. When confronted with, what's your problem? Why are you an alcoholic? It wants to put the blame out here. It was them, it was her, it was mommy and daddy, it was the way I was raised. My ego wants to keep the problem outside of me so I don't have to take any responsibility and it doesn't get close to me. Same with resentment. My ego wants to keep the problem out here. She left me. No, she didn't. They're doing it to me. No, you brought it on. My ego wants to keep the problem out here. I'm doing all this to get some stuff off my mind. When one realizes they have to sit down and talk for 12 hours on the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, there's always some things on the top of my mind. And there's always some things to let you know where I'm coming from a little bit. I never make notes. I go to the title page and I start to share. But I wanted to talk about some things that were currently interesting to me. I think one of the most important things one could learn about this book is that it's not a book filled with answers, which is a big trap for the ego. I remember when I heard a man hold up the book and he said, "The answers are in the big book." Now to me, nowadays, today, that's a half-truth. If he meant there's an answer to alcoholism in the big book, he was right. But for a guy like me to think that he meant I should look for answers in this book, I'm trapped. Now here's what I mean by that. Some people in this room have never stolen anything. Physically stolen. Some people in this room have. But if you've never physically stolen anything, I think if you're an alcoholic, your ego by nature is a thief. And what the ego wants to do, it wants to take a little over here, a little from these tapes, a little from this tape, a little from this book, a little from this girl, a little from this movie, a little from this novel, and put it in here and make it real. And we wonder why we have this committee of belief systems going on in our head, sometimes talking all at once. Sometimes one doesn't even know the other exists. We have the lover And he's based on everything we've learned about the lover. And we have the fighter. And he's based on little pieces. I mean, sometimes we get stuff from people we don't even like. So when my ego hears the answers are in the book, here's what my ego does. And this is looking back. My ego goes, aha. I don't have to be responsible to finding the answers. They're somewhere outside of me. And the biggest one of all, if they don't work, it's your fault. Told you. So I met a man who somehow knew me when he met me. Funny, I knew him when I heard him speak in my very first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. But the magic of AA happened. I not only knew that he had been like me, I knew that he wasn't anymore. And I think that's the magic that has to happen here for somebody to go to somebody that has what they want. How many times have they paraded people by us that we knew were just like us but didn't have an answer? I've been in places where they paraded people by you all day long. It was called the Michigan State Penitentiary, who had answers. But I never connected with one of those guys and said, you know, not only does this guy have an answer, he's been where I've been, because I would always say it would be a professional. It would be a minister or a psychiatrist or a whatever. And I would always say to myself, you know, he might really have an answer, but he never felt the way I did. He's never done what I did. Then, sometimes they parade somebody by you who's been where you've been, but didn't have an answer. I mean, if all we needed to find was somebody with an answer, if all we needed to find was somebody with a common problem, the county jail would have worked for a lot of us guys a long time ago. I needed to find a man who had a common problem and a common solution. And when I met this man, I not only knew he was like me, I knew he wasn't anymore. He had been changed. That's what I wanted. So, why do this work again? I know people that do the work from a good place. They don't wait to hit the wall. I know people that do the work for the love of God, to get closer to this contact. I know people with numbers of years that do this work because they're up against the wall. The sad thing is, they're closer to the first step than those that are doing it for a good reason. A lot of times you'll get somebody that comes to you and they want to do the work because now they've been around for a while and their life has become unmanageable. Either circumstantially or how they're feeling, or a combination of both. The problem with that person is the process doesn't start with our lives have become unmanageable and then we came to believe. The process starts with we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. And sometimes you have to get back through a whole lot of stuff, like 24 years, to remember why we're really here. To the truth about booze 24 years away from your last drink, or 10 years away from your last drink. Because see, here's what happens to people that think they're going to go through these steps and go through these steps because their life has become unmanageable. They poop out when they feel better because that's all they wanted. They come to you and they're a mess. Oh, I'm up against the wall emotionally, even though everything out here is great. Or everything out here is a mess and I'm feeling rotten. And they do the first step based on that. They never get to the truth about booze. And they poop out after 5, or they poop out halfway through amends because they've gotten some relief and they're feeling better and the circumstances have straightened out, or they're at peace the way they are, and they never finish. And then they wonder why 6 months or a year later they're up against the wall. I believe the process starts with an admission about me and the truth about alcohol. The sad thing is, the further away you are from your last drink, the harder that is to get back to, especially to make it current. Where am I with this disease today? The first step for me can't just be a fond recollection of what it was like when I look at the craving, or when I look at the obsession, these two major symptoms of alcoholism, I have to bring those into the present. Could that craving happen to me? Would that craving happen to me today if I was to take a drink? Is there anything in my 17 years of drinking that leads me to believe that craving wouldn't happen 10 years away from my last drink? And each time I have found there is nothing in my 17 years of drinking that leads me to believe that craving would be any different. Then the hard one. What about the obsession? Well, I see that it happened when I look back at my drinking, time after time after time after time. I would decide to stop and I would drink again. This time it'll be different. What happened last time won't happen. Or those times that you don't even think at all. Could that happen to me today, 10 years sober, walking out of a meeting with 100 phone numbers in my book, with all that I know, if the power of God doesn't continue to be there for me? Or is it what I'm doing? Maybe I'm someone who has the common belief that now that we're sober, we just wake up and choose not to drink every day. And I tell you, for 10 years, I've woken up every day and I've just chosen not to drink because now I have the power of choice. Maybe either it's my power or maybe even God has given me the power of choice. My God, what kind of a God are we dealing with? A God that would give you the power to do something that would kill you? Where me and alcohol are concerned, God better take me beyond choice. God better take me to a place the 10th step describes where the problem is removed in a fit spiritual condition. But see, what I want to forget is that it's a daily reprieve, and I want to start to refer to AA like an insurance policy. Well, I went to 14 meetings last week. I guess I really don't need to go to one today. My policy is paid up for the month. Or I meditated for an hour yesterday. I really don't need to today. And, I really admitted I was wrong yesterday. Why do I have to keep doing this today? Do I really have to admit that I was wrong today? Because my ego wants to convince me it isn't a daily reprieve, it's some kind of contingency plan. And I forget that me being in a neutral place with alcohol, placed in a position of neutrality, is a daily reprieve, contingent on my spiritual condition. So, I think there was a couple requirements that I was asked to follow by coming here. I was asked to be in this room at 7 o'clock on a Friday night in Baton Rouge. I'm an alcoholic. I don't come on Friday. I don't come on Thursday. I come Monday, right? I come on Monday because there's some people here that I really love. But I was asked to do a couple things, and if I could have if I could make one request, I would probably ask that you each in your own way, maybe tonight or right now while you're sitting here in silence, or when you go to bed tonight or when you get up tomorrow morning, if you're interested in more than some knowledge, if you're interested in more than me teaching or you learning, if you're actually interested in having some kind of an experience this weekend, that maybe we each in our own way pray in our own words that God could put aside what we think we know just long enough to have an open mind and a new experience. Because there will be some things, if there hasn't been already, especially when you mention choice to an alcoholic. I mean, that's really something I want to think that I have. That's that last little vestitude of the denial of the grace of God. I want to convince myself that I'm the one in charge of whether I drink again or not. That maybe we each in our own way pray to get past what we think we know. Because there will be some things in this process, every time you do it. I don't mean every time you study it. I mean every time that you do it, that will challenge what you think you know to be true. And that isn't comfortable. Take two guys going through the first step. They're just about to finish and move into step 2. One of them says, I feel really great. Everything's been wonderful. This has been a really great experience. This has been really nifty. The other guy says, I'm screwed. This hasn't been pleasant, and there better be some power from me. Who's closer to the first step? Well, the guy that I would worry about would be the guy that breezes right through it. Everything's hunky-dory. Ain't nothing the matter here, Ma. He hasn't touched anything. I've seen people write inventory, never touch themselves. I've seen people write inventory in 4-column resentment, never touch themselves, because their egos become so slick. They can slick their stuff right through the 4-column process. They're so good at it. Oh, I was selfish. I was dishonest. I was self-seeking. I was afraid. Next. And never touch them. Never touch truth. I remember when I was 5.5 months dry, and I'd been in the fellowship for 5.5 months, and things out here were better. I had a new place to live, I had a little girlfriend, I had a little bank account, I had a little car. I loved the meetings, I was making friends. And I woke up one day, 5.5 months away from my last drink, and I was dying. And it was in here. And I was given the grace to see the nature of my condition. I hit bottom with the second half of step 1. And I knew I was going to drink. It was a real familiar place. For some reason that day I got on my knees and I asked for help. And I was literally directed. It just came over me. You call this man that you heard in your very first meeting and you ask him to help you. I hadn't seen him since my first meeting when I was still in treatment. I'd seen some people he was working with. And I got on the phone and I called that man and he said, come out to my house. And he said he only knew one way to do this. And we were going to start on the title page and we were going to go through the first 164 pages together. And I'll tell you this. Now it's only 10 years later. For me it was a big deal at 30 days. They say there's no big deals. It was a big deal when I had 30 days for one reason. I never had more than 28 days in 17 years. Ever. And that was after 10 treatment centers, a year and a half in the Michigan State Penitentiary, becoming a therapist in a treatment center, drinking with the director of the program that I worked for. I mean, drunks understand that. Real alkies understand that. You're either a patient in one or you're a therapist in one, right? And it's all about finding out an answer to a question. For me, it was all about finding an answer to a question that I'd never found out in 30 years. What's wrong with me? Some people in the treatment field actually thought I was interested in helping somebody else. They didn't know that I was there in college to get a master's degree and later working in a treatment center to find out what's wrong with me. Because I thought if I got the right piece of information, it would all tie up and everything would be just fine. I think the difference between finding out information about alcoholism and experiencing the first step is like this. Imagine you have a disease. That's not hard for us to imagine. Imagine it's easier though for an alcoholic with an ego like I have to consider something what I think is a little more deadly. Interesting story. I sponsor a guy in Los Angeles with HIV. virus. I mean, we're talking about a mind-opening experience for me. He comes to my house and he says, I was diagnosed with AIDS virus, HIV, 7 years ago. And I decided to live with the virus. It has not progressed in 7 years. I no longer refer to HIV as my primary disease because I suffer from alcoholism, and it has progressed for 7 years. And I am worse. So I think of myself with a disease. And I think I've gone all over the world for 20 years looking for a doctor with a cure. And nobody's been able to tell me what's wrong with me. And I finally end up with this little doctor. And he says, we finally found out what's wrong with you. And in one breath, I take a deep breath, and I go, thank God. And in the next breath, he says, but it's terminal, and there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. That's my experience with the first step. It's really great to find out what's wrong with you. It's not so great to find out that no human power can relieve what you suffer from. No sponsor, no group, no right amount of knowledge, no right amount of information. My God, I knew more about alcoholism then than I do now. As far as the disease, I used to give unbelievable lectures on THIQ and neurotransmitters and chemical enzyme reactions in the body of an alcoholic, and didn't have one clue why I was powerless over alcohol. I knew more than I had experienced. And there's nothing worse than spending some time in Alcoholics Anonymous acquiring a lot of knowledge, even about this book, and not getting the experience, and wondering when you read something a little further on in this book, and you say to yourself, my God, I've dotted the I's, and I've crossed the T's, and I've made all the neat little marks, but this isn't happening. Because all you've done was study it. You haven't done it. I think big book studies and big book workshops are interesting. And I think what Joe and Charlie do is unbelievable. And what they want to do is they want to get people excited about what's in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. But if all you do is sit and listen, and you don't take the action to go out and find out how to have one, it's worthless. You end up with a head full of AA with no experience with power. It's like the kid that went off to find out what it would be like to have an orgasm, and all he did was learn about it and try to mimic what it would be like. And I've done that. I've tried to do that, and it's futile. So when I went out to this man's house, and here's one of the biggest lies of all that I found out that day. I wasn't in AA. All I was a member of the fellowship, because he talked to me about the circle and the triangle. He talked to me about unity, recovery, and service. And my God, all I was a member of the fellowship. I wasn't involved in recovery, and I wasn't involved in service. And he started by asking me, Joe, where do you find unity? And I said, in the fellowship, and all these great things we do with people in AA. And he said, are you in that part of the program? And I said, yeah. I went to more than 90 meetings in 90 days. I've been around for 5 months. I got 3 commitments. I'm a treasurer, etc., etc., etc. And I was dying of untreated alcoholism. I was dying of a part of the disease that I didn't even know I had. He said, where do you find recovery? I said, on the wall. He laughed. It hurt my feelings. He said, Joe, when they put the steps on the wall, they made a mistake in your case because they left the directions out in between, and they left them up to idiots like you to figure out. He said, we find recovery, the recovery part of this program, in the first 164 pages of this book. Are you involved in that? And I said, well, I took the first 3 steps with a man, and I tried to write inventory, and I got to the part of the inventory that asked me to look at my part with every resentment I ever had, where I was selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and afraid, and I couldn't do it. Emotionally, physically, spiritually, I couldn't do it. He said, then you're not involved in recovery. He said, what did they do with you with the first step? I said, I sat in a chair across from a man. He said, are you powerless over alcohol? And I said, yes, because I get in a lot of trouble. And he said, is your life unmanageable? I said, yes, because look at what a mess it is. He said, that's not the first step. He said, the first step has nothing to do with the trouble you got in or how much of a mess your life is. He said, what about the second step? I said, well, the man asked me, do I believe in God? I said, yeah. He said, do you believe in God? I said, yeah, but I think this God is going to strike me down as soon as I'm a bad AA member. He said, then you haven't taken the second step. He says, what about the third step? I said, well, we opened the book to some page in here, and we read some silly prayer, and I had no idea what it meant, and he set me off on how to write inventory. And I couldn't do it. He said, so then you're not involved in the recovery part of this program, are you? And I said, no. He said, what about service? And I was a little angry. I said, well, I'm taking patients to meetings from where I used to go to treatment. He said, oh, you're carrying alcoholics to the message. There's a big difference. And I woke up to the fact I was in 1/3 of AA expecting the results of the other 2/3. Then he says, what kind of disease is alcoholism? I said threefold disease, body, mind, and spirit. See, because I'd heard that. I had learned that. It was something I had learned. I didn't have a clue what that meant. Alcoholism is a threefold disease, body, mind, and spirit. I'd heard it in treatment. I'd rattled it off. My God, I didn't even know why I was raising my hand every day for 90 days. I'm Joe, I'm an alcoholic. Because my life is a mess and I got in a lot of trouble drinking? But you got to go with what you have. You got to start with what you have. And what I had was a bunch of lies. He said, you know there's a part of the program for each part of your disease? I said, no, I didn't know that. He said, yeah, how many times have you heard, bring the body, the mind will follow? I said, I've heard that. He says, what do you think that means? I said, well, you bring your body to the fellowship. You don't drink. He said, can you do that? Can you keep yourself from drinking? I said, no. He said, then what are you going to do with this mind of yours? He said, you bring your mind to the recovery process. And then having a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, you take your awakened spirit out into the world and back into the program to be of service. All of a sudden I saw a 3-part program for a 3-part disease. He said, do you know there's a set of 12 spiritual principles for each part of the program? I said, no. He said, well, there's 12 traditions for the fellowship, and there's 12 steps for recovery, and there's 12 concepts of service. All of a sudden I saw a 3-part program for a 3-part disease with 36 spiritual principles rather than 12. I said, well, I don't know about in Louisiana, but in California they make a really sad statement sometimes at meetings. Not in my group, but at some meetings. You know what they say? The traditions are to the group what the steps are to the individual. And you know what that does to newcomers like me that are only concerned with themselves? They say, nothing in the traditions for me. You know what this man said to me? He said, Joe, when we get through these steps, you're going to find one day there's as many principles in the traditions for you as an individual to live your life as there are in the steps and in the concepts. And all of a sudden, after being in the fellowship for 5 or 6 months, I found out more about AA from the circle and the triangle than I did going to meetings for 5.5 months. I saw a 3-part program, unity, recovery, and service, a 3-part disease, body, mind, and spirit, and I saw 36 spiritual principles. About a week later, I was at a noon meeting in a church in East Denver, and I spent my first 4 years in Denver. And In the church, the room for the meeting is upstairs, and it looks down into the chapel. And in the chapel, there's these big stained glass windows with huge circles and triangles. And I went up to the minister afterwards, and I said, "You know that's the AA symbol?" He said, "Yeah, we've had you all here for about 20 years." He said, "But do you know that that's an ancient spiritual symbol that means body, mind, and spirit as one?" And I thought to myself, my God, that's the same thing my sponsor told me about our symbol. And the great promise of the circle is that I can one day become whole, not confined to one part of the disease or the other. Because I know this about the first 30 years of my life. I have always lived in one part of my disease or the other. Before I ever drank, I suffered from a spiritual malady, a malady of the spirit. I found every description in the big book of untreated alcoholism or the spiritual malady fits me before I ever took a drink. Restless, irritable, discontent, full of fear, everything on page 52. Trouble with personal relationships, can't control my emotions, prey to misery and depression. And the greatest one of all, in the doctor's opinion, a part of our disease separates us and differentiates us like a distinct entity. And the first time I read that, I thought to myself, my God, I remember sitting in my mom's backyard, 10, 11, and 12 years old, before I ever took a drink, dreaming that a spaceship was going to land and a little green man was going to get out and tell me I wasn't really born here on this planet, that they had brought me here as a teeny baby, and that this was just a test. Separate, different, and apart, like a distinct entity. Then I started drinking and taking drugs when I was 13 years old, and I was either involved in the obsession or the craving or the spiritual malady at all times, except when the alcohol worked, except when something treated my problem. He said the first promise of our book, and I feel so sad sometimes. I was asked to speak at a meeting not too long ago, and they wanted me to speak on the 12 promises. I said, which 12 promises might you be speaking of? They said, oh, the 12 promises on page 83, halfway through the 9th step. I said, and I told them when I spoke, I said, you people have to understand, it's my experience, there's a lot of promises before these 12 and a lot of promises after them. I mean, some of the greatest promises in our book come before you even take the 3rd step. And there's some promises of what will happen in the 1st step if you don't proceed. And there are some unbelievable promises that never even came true when alcohol worked in the 10th step. Why don't we hear the 10th step? Why don't we hear the 10th step promises talked about as much as the ones halfway through the 9th step? Now I'm going to say something here, and this was said to me about 3 years ago, and I got angry. So I suppose someone else will get angry like I did. And this is what this man said to me. And I had to think about it for a minute. And he said, I'm not talking about the 12th step. He said, there's a lot of people doing a lot with the 12th step of Alcoholics Anonymous in Alcoholics Anonymous. But you know what he said to me? He said, there's very little past the 9th step in AA. And I looked around and I started to be open to that and look and search for the number of people who had really finished amends and really do stuff with 10 and 11. And I couldn't think of very many. And I saw what he meant. And I had to look at where I was at. And I was holding on to 4 amends I didn't want to finish. Again. But one of the greatest promises on the title page is that this is a story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. Have you ever thought what some of us say to the newcomer when we say, my name is Joe, and I'm a recovering alcoholic? And then they ask you, the new person asks you, how long have you been here? Well, I've been recovering for 10 years. Did you ever wonder the message that sends out to alcoholics that are new? I mean, thank God they don't have much sense when they're new, but if they had any sense of all, they'd probably say to themselves, AA doesn't work. I will always be recovering. Now, I can only speak about the moment. I can't tell you about yesterday. I can't tell you about tomorrow. But right now, here in this moment, as I understand alcoholism, a threefold disease, in this moment right now, I can say to you, I am a recovered alcoholic. I ain't craving it because there ain't none in my system. The physical part of alcoholism is not going on inside of me. Because the only way that happens is when I put booze in my system, and I ain't craving booze, so I ain't suffering from that part of the disease. And you know what? Right now, in this moment, I am not obsessed about alcohol, nor have I been obsessed about alcohol for a long time. I am not suffering from the mental part of alcoholism. And you know what? Right now, in this moment, I am not suffering from the spiritual malady either. I have recovered from alcoholism. I have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And I stay here to maintain that because I continue to suffer from a spiritual malady on a regular basis in the form of resentment and fear and selfishness and dishonesty. And if that part of my disease goes untreated, the obsession to drink will return and I will drink again and that craving will still be there. I think there has to come a time when we have to stand up that this program and say that this program works and that you can recover from alcoholism. I mean, how long can you stay in AA and justify unbelievably selfish behaviors because I'm an alcoholic? I tell my sponsor, I beat up my girlfriend, I strangled my boss, I got fired because I'm an alcoholic. He says, no, I think you did that stuff because you're an asshole. You can only hide behind alcohol. You can only hide behind being an alcoholic about as long as you can hide behind, honey, I was drunk. Right? Until you find out the most insane thing you ever did wasn't even drinking. Wasn't anything we did under the influence. That's a phenomenal idea nowadays in AA, because I go a lot of places where people think the insanity of alcoholism is the crazy stuff that some of us do under the influence of alcohol. And it ain't. It ain't. He started to lay out the program to me through the table of contents. A lot of people know where the third step is. A lot of people don't even know where the third step is, and the book tells you now we're at step 3. Where's the third step? Well, the third step's in the 12 and 12. Right? Bill didn't write the 12 and 12 as a guide to directions to work in the steps. He wrote it 18 years after doing the work as a reflection, looking back. I'm 10 years sober. I've written inventory for 10 years, and I could never, to this day, I could never in my wildest dreams figure out how to write a 4th step from the 12 and 12. And I don't have a bad mind. I got a pretty good mind. But a lot of people don't know where the first 2 steps are. I think it's as simple as this. If after the ABCs it says, now we're at step 3, and this is a textbook, it would only make sense to me that everything from the doctor's opinion to the ABCs is steps 1 and 2. I think it's that simple, but I would like it to be a lot more complicated. I don't think it is. If this is a textbook, which they're going to tell us in the preface this is, and it's not a novel, it's not a book just to relate to and to the feelings of these people. If it really is a textbook laid out in order, and the 3rd step starts after the ABCs, I think everything from what used to be page 1, boy was that a mistake. Everything from what used to be page 1 in the original text, the first printing of the first edition. I think they made a big mistake when they put Roman numerals on the doctor's opinion. Because you know what that's done to a lot of people around this country? It's not important. Step 1 starts at Bill's story. My God, I found out some stuff that really tied some things up for me in the doctor's opinion. So my sponsor told me we were going to use from the doctor's opinion, and this is up for debate, but I used to page 52 in the chapter to the agnostic to look at 3 parts of step 1. Then the whole chapter to the agnostic for step 2. And then the rest is simple. Step 3 and 4 are in how it works. Step 5 through 11 are in into action. Step 12 is in working with others. And I think the second half of step 12 is in the rest of the chapters, 8 through 11. I think we have a tendency nowadays to disassociate everything after working with others too. But I think if working with others is about working with others, then the rest of the chapters might be about practicing these principles in all your affairs. I mean, the first 164 pages are either a textbook or they aren't. I believe step 1 sets out the problem, and step 2 is the solution, and 3 through 11 are how to find it, and step 12 is how to practice it. I agree with all that basic stuff. But what I would like to do at each point, because you're all basically interested in the big book, and you've all done a lot with Joe and Charlie, and some of you have listened to those silly tapes that I did 5 years ago, okay? And some of you actually work the steps. So what about as I go through this? My focus and my prayer for the last week has been that I would like to center on 3 things. My experience when I was doing it the first time, and how I consider each of these parts of the book today. My consideration, 10 years sober, starting this work with the title page would be, am I still willing to commit myself to all 3 parts of this program? Where doing it the first time, it was a big deal just to find out there were 3 parts to the program. So can I take the steps where I am today? Maybe when considering the circumstances